For everyone joining us, Victoria, thank you for trusting me with this moment of launching what is a brilliant book that will change policy and hearts and minds, and really also to you, Claire, for your vision in actually creating this network and creating this space. As we're thinking intergenerationally, you certainly are emerging as a leader and a deeply committed woman, feminist, and fantastic human being. So thanks to you both. It's humbling and so deeply satisfying for us to be together in ways that I never would have imagined even 5 years ago. So with that, though, we'll get to the thing that matters most, and Victoria, that is your new book. So I think as feminists, as scholars, as people engage with advocacy around violence and gender, we all know acutely that names matter. Names matter. Naming matters. So maybe we could start with the name of your book, right? Start with the title of the book, Textures of Terror, the murder of Claudina Isabel Velásquez and her father's quest for justice. Victoria, maybe you can take us through what's at stake and what matters, and why this is the frame you've given to us to think about this body of work.
Great. Thank you so much, Brigittine. And I also do want to thank the Red Interamericana Antifemicidio and Claire, who I've already thanked, but the University of Illinois class for providing this venue and doing all of the coordination for this is lovely. And I also, of course, want to thank my team, the press team at UC Press, especially Kate Marshall, for shepherding through the book, which I will show you because I mean, Brigittine is a person who read it when it was in draft form, and this is the book, and I think it's a beautiful book, and I feel like every hand that touched it in its production honored the story of Claudina Isabel and her father's quest. And so words do matter, and I think the Textures of Terror, it is, because that's what the story is, as you move through Jorge's struggle, what happened to Claudina, that she was murdered as a law student, but also as you read and hear about the stories of the other women who fled Guatemala. They fled gender violence in Guatemala and their harrowing experiences. What comes to mind, and I think the reason I chose Textures of Terror, was accompanying Jorge and other survivors of human rights violations over the years. I first started working in Guatemala in 1990. Is that terror has a texture, and it feels different in different places at different times and different moments. And I think that you embody that feeling. I mean, you know that, Brigittine, from the work that you've done in Guatemala as well, and Clara as well in her work. You embody it. You know the people you work with have embodied experiences. In Guatemala, people will talk about susto, and they'll say that someone dies from susto. And if you look at the definition of the word susto, it says fright, right? Like fright or being startled. But that's not what susto is. Susto is a malady of the soul. It's a malady of the heart and soul. And, women would tell me that their babies died because they got susto from their breast milk. And people would say, well, that's crazy. And now, in the 20 years since women were telling me that, we know from scientific research that DNA is altered by trauma, and that women's breast milk changes because of trauma. And so they knew what was happening to their bodies as they were embodying that trauma. So the textures of terror are inside of us all in different ways and in different registers, right? Because it depends on what your situation is. I can leave because I have a US passport, right? But for the women who can't leave, that's a different situation, right? And the murder of Claudina Isabel, this story, I mean, I didn't choose it, it chose me. I was asked by a friend to speak with Jorge Velásquez, and I was just shocked that he wasn't Mayan, because I was used to accompanying Mayan massacre survivors who were seeking justice. And Jorge's taller than me, he's whiter than me, he's urbane, he's an upper middle class auditor. He clearly speaks Spanish better than I do. Why would he want me to go with him? And what I discovered was that, you know, justice simply is not accessible. Justice is not accessible. And, you know, Jorge was just determined. And because he was an auditor, he audited the legal system. And so it was just this sort of oddly fascinating experience to accompany someone. I'm a person who has papers stacked all over always. My papers, my books, everything's in stacks. Jorge has everything completely organized, and like his cacti are organized by size. You know, he's an auditor. Everything is really orderly. And I used to think when we would work together and he would come over to my house in Guatemala and go into my office that just had piles of paper, I knew it was hard for him to not organize my papers, you know, in the process. But I'm kind of digressing. But I mean, I think, you know, that I guess that's what I have to say about the title and why it's Textures of Terror, because in the midst of that, you have regular everyday life, right? I'm nursing a child and Jorge's visiting me, and I've got piles of paper, and he's thinking I'm a really messy person, right? So yeah, that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Victoria. You know, if we could follow that a little bit, you, by any measure, are a very prolific writer. So your office makes sense because you're always writing, you're always contributing, you're always pushing in important ways. So you have many projects and many books and many things that you're working on. Out of all of that, I think it would be great for us to hear a little bit about why this book now. Why was this the next book? Why this project in this moment out of everything that you do?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think, you know, because it chose me. I couldn't, it wouldn't let me go. It just wouldn't let me go. And it's, I know that sounds kind of odd, but I mean, I've done research in Colombia. I have a project on Colombia that's always lurching forward slowly that I still haven't finished. I have other projects on Guatemala also in the works that I haven't finished. And this story simply would not let me go. And part of it, I think, is having accompanied Jorge all that time, but it just, the story wouldn't let me go. And I think, you know, we talk about structures of violence, we talk about systems of violence, we talk about the oligarchy and organized crime and drug dealers and all of the dark forces that make impunity reign in Guatemala. But I don't think that we can really understand what it means in daily life unless we listen to people's stories. And I really appreciated Claire's conclusion that it's a book about hope, because I think on the one hand, these are tough stories, but on the other hand, they're also stories of love, because I think all of us who do human rights work also know that at the end of the day, the driving force for people who are pushing for truth, for justice, they're driven by love. They're not driven by politics. They're driven by love. And this particular story, Claudina's story, and then the stories of the other women that are woven in there, they're all stories of love. They're trying to survive. They're trying to protect their children. They're trying to find a better place to be in life. And this story just wouldn't let me go. And I think also because I started trying to, I started writing about like, what was it that I was feeling? And that's why it ended up being kind of part memoir. And I think it's also because I worked with Jorge for so long. And I met him in 2007. That was when we started working on his daughter's case. So this is a really long-term project. And I mean, I changed over that time also, right? And I think of, what is it, Portelli, who talks about when you in the, what is it, the death of Luigi Trastulli, and he talks about how the time when you speak with someone, it matters like in their life, where they are at that point when they talk to you. But it also matters where you are, what you can hear, right? Because part of it is the testimonies and stories that people share with us. And the other part of it is, where are we as the listeners, as the witnesses? And then how are we going to honor those stories and experiences that have been shared with us? And then I think there's a space where there are these shared experiences, right? I mean, and there's a moment in Guatemala where Jorge's accompanying me after I had threats in Guatemala, right? And we were so used to accompanying one another. It's like, well, I'll go with you. And he took me every place I needed to go, from the U.S. Embassy to prosecutors' offices, to make my denuncia, right? So it's this sort of shared experience. And I think that's part of it. It's in my DNA too now, I guess, because I spent so much time with him and on this case.
This is so, yeah, what you're sharing is so vulnerable and so illuminating. I'm taking notes as I'm thinking about, I want to stop and take notes. So in that, I'm wondering, you brought us to experiences and kind of following this thread, and really this metaphor that we use a lot in Guatemala of weaving, right? That we learn from women who weave together everything from clothing to families to hope. And so could you tell us more about the process of the stories of the women, like the choices you made to weave particular voices and stories into the case of Claudina? Yeah, why, which women, and how did you make those connections? What did you see? And then I'll foreshadow and say the second part of that question is, you of course are, your own story is woven into the book. So the choices you made about representing other women's voices, and then your own choices about what you shared with us in your own experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. You might have to remind me of the second
Yeah, I
part of
will.
the question. But the first, I think that's a really good question, because, when we write, we don't always know where exactly the writing comes from, right? This is like part of the magic and terror of writing, right? Is that we're not sure exactly how, we know English writing is like anything else. There's a system and a structure, but then the individual experience of it, we all have different moments. And how did I choose these stories? I think when I look at it now, I chose these other women's particular stories of the many, many different stories that women have shared with me, because I felt they were kind of representative of different Guatemalan women's experiences, right? Because Claudina Isabel was a 19-year-old law student, and she was murdered brutally. Her case was discounted from the minute that the police found her. They said that she was a prostitute because she had a belly button ring and was wearing sandals. And she was a law student, but even if she had been a prostitute, that case still needs to be investigated, right? And so part of the choice in choosing these other women's stories was to show how much less access you have based on this intersectional positioning, right? If you're a monolingual Mom Maya speaker, a girl who's 12 years old, who's sold into conjugal slavery, what are your options, right? Like how does that collapse the limited life that was already in front of you? And that there, to also show different moments in spaces in Guatemala. What does it mean to work on a plantation, right? What does it mean to be a woman working on a plantation? What happens when gender violence happens there? And then I wanted to include also a woman who was wealthier, right? Because gender violence isn't something that only happens to poor women. Gender violence happens to women in all economic spheres. And obviously a 12-year-old Mom Maya girl, her options are much more limited when she wants to, seek justice. I just have to turn off my air conditioner. It's got cold in here. For this upper class woman, I wanted to show her story as well. What happened to her? She was just completely discounted. Her husband was very powerful, and so that was sort of what I thought when I put those stories together, right? So I was sharing these particular women's stories. But then when I went back, and this is literally after the book was done, when I had finished writing the book, I realized that each of those stories also showed different ways that the system failed these women. So, one story is that she goes to the doctor after she's been beaten and she's found passed out, tied up to a tree. They didn't even do a rape kit. I mean, they did nothing. And the medical establishment completely failed her. The police were never called. These different, all of the things that should happen, because part of what Jorge did is, in his audit of the legal system, is we learned what you're supposed to do, right? So what are the protocols if gender violence happens? What are the protocols if a woman is murdered? And what we saw systematically in his daughter's case was at every corner, they did exactly the opposite of what they were supposed to do, or nothing. And in these other women's cases, it kind of shows spotlights in each of these different sectors. One is about the failure of the medical system. Another is about the police, the police actually using the femicide law against the women, instead of using it to support her. The judges not understanding the laws or being willfully ignorant of them. The police not doing their jobs, the prosecutors not doing their jobs. And so it ended up also showing, I think, shining a light on these different structural failures, and how those affected the women. And I do also, want to say that, today Title 42 is being lifted, which was Trump's don't let anyone in the country because there's COVID, but it was really his way of building a legal wall to stop people from coming into the country. And I think that there's a real misnomer happening right now in the United States, and that is that all of the information that's being presented is that we've sent troops to the border, and we're doing that because smugglers are encouraging people, that our laws are the pull for people to come here. People don't come here because they feel invited. They come here because they're desperate to leave. They're desperate to flee. And if we were smart in the United States and we developed better policies and supported better governments in Central America, people wouldn't be fleeing their homes the way that they are. These women wouldn't have to flee their homes. They'd rather stay in their home country with their extended family and their network, than flee by themselves with a baby through the desert.
Yeah, I think probably everyone listening is nodding their head in agreement. No one wants to arrive here. It's much better to be with your family and your people when it's only right, the lack of options. So hopefully maybe we can explore that, following your expertise in a little more depth in a minute, although I'm tempted to jump, but I wanted, because you grounded us, Victoria, so profoundly, so intimately, really, in the experiences of these women. We're close, we're not zoomed out. And I think that's one of the gifts of your writing, is you're able to bring us very close to the folks who have trusted you to tell their stories. And I think you shared with us how and why you were making those choices. It would be incomplete if you didn't tell us a little bit about your own place in the narrative as a woman, as a feminist, as a mom with a baby, when a creep shows up at your front door. That was one of the most harrowing moments for me. So I think if you feel like sharing with us.
Sure. See, I knew I would need you to remind me of the second part of the question. Thank you. I wasn't willfully ignoring it. I mean, I think that's what also helped me to be able to move the book forward as well, as to think about what my own experience had been. And yeah, I mean, I think, but when I was, before I was a mother, the last place that I was doing research was in the combat zone in northern Colombia, on the Atrato River, where we were pretty regularly stopped by paramilitaries, FARC, guerrilla, and the Colombian army, and a couple of times stopped at gunpoint, not just routine stops, but stopped at gunpoint and removed from our boats. So when I used to do that research, and this was in peace communities, people were living in, they had created these peace communities that were supposed to be respected by the armed actors. And so they weren't really, but they were not respected at all if they tried to travel from one community to the next. So that makes life kind of impossible if you can't move freely. And I used to think, I am going to answer your question, but I think this is important, because I used to think, people would say to me when I would give a talk, a public talk about the work, they would say, well, aren't you scared? Aren't you worried that something's going to happen to you? And I would say, I honestly, I just have very rarely felt frightened. And I think maybe if I was a mother, I might feel differently, but no. And honestly, I really thought then that it wouldn't make any difference. But as soon as I was pregnant, I had actually been planning on doing some research on gangs in the urban periphery of Bogota. And I just felt so protective of my belly, I didn't do that research. I was just, because I knew how easy it could be to have something bad happen. And so I mean, in that sense, like having a baby definitely did change my life. And I think part of the reason I ended up going with Jorge as well is I didn't think it was really going to happen, because he's evangelical. I'm an atheist. I thought he's going to try to evangelize me and I'm going to step away, I'm going to walk away. And he never did. And, we had these really interesting conversations about everything all the time. And so it just, the terror part, the textures of terror, it just kind of creeps in. It's not the same, like doing the research for this book. I was also working on, because I had done this forensic work in the communities where massacres had happened in the early 90s. There were good lawyers, good prosecutors who wanted forensic assistance on some high impact human rights cases of extrajudicial execution, of prison massacre, et cetera. And so I was kind of helping them on the side by connecting them to experts in New York and London and Florida. And I didn't really see myself as being involved in those cases. I felt like I was like, had 6 degrees of separation somehow from them. And then things started happening, right? Little things started happening. I don't think that the threats had anything to do with Jorge. I don't think it had to do with working on his daughter's case. I think it was probably those other cases, although some of my colleagues think it might have been from the work on the genocide case. In any case, what happened to me was, it's a slow accretion, right? And for people who work in Guatemala know that they don't call it an amenaza, a threat, they call it an advertencia, a warning. So there are different ways that you get warnings, right? You get a warning by someone calling what they think is your phone, but it ends up being your neighbor's phone, because you live in a house that's been divided into littler houses, because it used to be a really big house, and they have the original phone. So they get the threat for you. And fortunately, that neighbor came over and told us that someone had called with a really rough voice looking for me. And it reminded her of before, right? And so when people say that, they're referencing the genocide. They're referencing the military regimes of the 80s, and little things like that. Every time Jorge and I would leave the house, as we would walk to the street, there was a woman. She would get on her phone and start describing what we were wearing or which direction we were going. And so those are those are warnings, right? They're like letting you know that you're being watched. But certainly the story that you reference is like the most terrifying one. Well, the thing the going to the door and opening the little thing and seeing this guy there at 6:30 in the morning saying, "We've come for the garbage," right? That's a vignette in the book. We've come for the garbage. And I know that he's not just a soldier, but he was a professional. He was in his mid-30s. He was wearing a nice Adidas tracksuit. He was not a garbage boy. And he took my photo with his phone. And he said, "We always come for the garbage." And so and I'm like, okay, great. It's 6:30 in the morning and I have to get on a flight to Tokyo today. And it's the first time I'm leaving my daughter. So, I have some friends who are diplomats. That's where my daughter went. And I was terrified and I couldn't, and the ridiculous thing, anyone who's an academic knows, I had fronted for my plane ticket from Guatemala. It was like $2,500 or something, was something ridiculous to get to this thing in Tokyo for the short period of time that I was going. And I had to go in order to be reimbursed and I couldn't afford to eat the $2,500. So I still went. Right. I mean, those are like these, weird spaces. Right. And so it makes what ends up happening is the hair on the back of your neck is up. Right. And so you're trying to figure out like where is that coming from? How do I exit this situation? Right. What am I going to do? How am I going to do it? What's going to be the way out? Right. But I'm fortunate, I have a US passport, so I was able to leave.
Thank you for sharing that with us. There are so many things that I would like to ask you to follow that. But I think you have gently said numerous times, the relationship of these stories of these women in Guatemala to a US context, and really, right, how we need to be having these conversations across borders and thinking about flows and impunity and structures throughout the Americas. So maybe we should take that up and honor what you've given us by having you share a little bit with us about migration and why and how women's migration figures centrally into the stories that you're trying to tell.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. The migration, these women, the women's stories, they migrate because they're fleeing violence and they don't have a safe place to be. That's the moral of that story is that they try everything they can and they can't stay. And so they have to flee and they have to leave. And the women in my book are women who fled before the Trump regime in this country, before women and children were being separated, before we took babies away from their mothers. And I think for me, one of the most difficult parts of that book for me to write were actually about that, to think that this woman survived all of these things and she had her baby and she came, and like if she had come 2 years later, she would have had that baby taken away from her at the border after she had suffered all of those horrible things. And I mean, it's heartbreaking that happened in this country. And there's still children who haven't been reunited with their parents who were separated in that time period. I don't know what the exact numbers of those are now. Peter Shea at the Center for Constitutional Law does amazing work on this issue, and so does Bill Ong-Hing in San Francisco. There's so many lawyers who do just amazing work trying to help people, and it's not only on the individual level, but it's on this constitutional level. We're violating international laws when we do that. People have a right to present themselves and request asylum. And with the Biden administration, the plan that they unveiled is to set up centers, one in Colombia and one in Guatemala, where you have to go to ask for asylum. So you think of like someone fleeing violence, whether it's state violence or gang violence or gender violence. Now, what you have to do is go to a center that's going to be run in conjunction with the Guatemalan government, ran in conjunction with the Colombian government. The one in Colombia is for Venezuelans. It's not really for Colombians, it's for Venezuelans because they can't set it up in Venezuela. But the one in Guatemala, I mean, it's like, why would you go there? You'd have no reason to believe that your story would be safe there, that you would be safe when you leave that place. And plus, where are you supposed to go? If you're a woman fleeing violence in the home, you're supposed to go into this weird space and ask for help and then go back to your abuser. And if you survive 2 to 3 months, it's going to take them to process the paperwork. Then you may get permission to seek asylum in the United States. And the second part of that is if you don't follow that procedure, they're saying that you won't be eligible when you present yourself. And I mean, these are going to be constitutional cases in the end, because under international law, you're supposed to be able to present yourself and seek asylum. And back in the 80s, during the wars in Central America, I worked with refugees. I directed Oakdale Legal Assistance, which was a refugee legal program in rural Louisiana. And you think, why would you have a refugee program in rural Louisiana? Well, that's because the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, that preceded Homeland Security, they set up their largest prison and deportation center in the middle of rural Louisiana. And so they were picking up refugees from the wars in El Salvador and Guatemala, in New York and in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, and shipping them to this place in rural Louisiana. It was a town with 2,000 people in it, Oakdale, Louisiana. It was 5 hours from Houston, 4 hours from New Orleans. This is before there was internet, before there were fax machines, right? This is 1985. Fax machines had not yet been invented. We had third-day delivery of Federal Express, and the New York Times arrived 1 week late, right? I mean, so you were really, really isolated. And this is where they chose to send people so they could have a deportation factory and move them from that facility to the airport in New Orleans and deport them. So we set up this refugee legal assistance program. And I saw an article, a colleague of mine sent me this article actually, about how the US was saying that people won't, if you don't make them use an app to check in, that they're never going to show up. I remember a poor Salvadoran guy who we had raised a bonded him out, got him on a bus from rural Louisiana to Los Angeles, where he had family. That poor man wasn't able to find a lawyer who would help him. So he took the bus back to where we were in Louisiana for his court hearing, right? And people want to have legal status. People want to follow the rules. And the way that they get represented as somehow being lying, sneaky, thieving people. I mean, seriously, who are these immigrants? These are the people we were hailing as our essential workers during the pandemic. They're the people who take care of our children, take care of our elderly, clean our homes, build our buildings, do all of these essential jobs and jobs that we need, infrastructural jobs that we need. And we won't recognize them. So, I mean, I think that this immigration question, there are so many moving parts, but it's not impossible to come up with different solutions. And the first solution is that people who live and work in this country should be given a legal status. We haven't had major immigration reform since Ronald Reagan. It's ridiculous. How is that even possible? We really need to provide people with legal status. I mean, they're not second-class citizens because they're not even citizens, right? And I mean, this is the DACA kids, like it just makes absolutely no sense. I mean, how democratic can our democracy be if that's how we treat human beings who live and work in our country and provide services? And at the same time, the Biden administration also has this big infrastructure project, the new infrastructure law that is going to create tens and tens of thousands of jobs. They literally don't have the workers to perform all of these different jobs. So it's like people aren't talking to each other. They're just taking up political positions that are really convenient and trying to attract the support of like a small base of people, and then misinform the rest of the American public about who the refugees are and what the border means. Our border has never been open. It's always been a closed border. It's always been a challenge to come through it. But I don't think that we should have these kinds of policies. It just doesn't make sense. It's not going to resolve the issue, because the first error is to think that there's only the pull factor that draws people to come here. There are push factors, and we fail to address those.
Oh, Victoria, I hear another book there.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, I'm struck by how quickly you were able to take us to Oakdale, Louisiana when we still had ice in the mid-80s. And quite quickly you wove that history into our current, political discourse and discussion. I think one of the many gifts of your work is that you're able to link, and whatever you're working on, you're able to link a long history of practices, situate people within those practices, and then connect them to what's unfolding now. So in there then brings me to a question that's related both to, I think, where you're taking us. Can you share with us how then you explicitly, because it's there, but I think we'd be enlightened to hear your perspective on relationships between institutions of the state and violence, both in Guatemala, but also outside of Guatemala in the United States. So there are like 4 questions in there. It's about the state and its relationship to violence over the period of time that you've been working in Guatemala, but also here, because there is this dialectic. It's never just there. It's always here and there, right? I think you're pushing us to see those connections.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. So we want to start with institutions of violence. Then let's start with the School of the Americas, right? Let's start with the School of the Americas. If you look at declassified documents, or if you go to the School of the Americas webpage, what you can find is a list of it's the people who want to stop the School of the Americas. It's not the actual School of the Americas. School of the Americas is the United States military training facility that's changed its name, I don't know, more than a dozen times since it was begun in the late 1940s. And, a lot of people whose names we're familiar with were trained there, not once, not twice, but often 3 or 4 times. So Rios Montt, genocidaire, Lucas Garcia, genocidaire, Augusto Pinochet, killer, Videla, General Videla from Argentina, killer. When I did the research for Buried Secrets, I found, I think it was like 265 different officers were trained in the School of the Americas. And, it's a school for torturers. I mean, the policies that were carried out in Guatemala during the genocide, all of those soldiers had received training from their superiors who were trained in the United States. There were US military advisors there, CIA was there, Israeli intelligence was there. There's a great interview that Elizabeth Farnsworth did for public television in the 1980s. And when I was preparing testimony for the Spanish court on the genocide, I wrote to all of these journalists who had covered the war in Guatemala in the 1980s, asking if they had any evidence they could share with me. And they were all so extraordinarily generous with me, making time to talk to me, sharing information that they had. Elizabeth Farnsworth sent me copies of shows. John Lee Anderson talked to me on Skype when he had just returned to London from Syria. I mean, these people were, because they were all marked by the war in Guatemala. I mean, that I want to say, like, that's part of when we think about connections between people and institutions. all of those individuals. Mary Jo McConaughey has been so kind and generous to me these past few days, just supporting my book. And she also covered the wars in Central America. But the military people who were trained by the United States. In the piece that Elizabeth Farnsworth sent me, there was a guy, I don't remember what his name was. He was maybe a captain in the army or something, but he spoke English. And in the interview with her, she says, "Oh, you speak English. Where did you learn English?" And he's like, "Oh, I learned English in South Africa," because he had gone to South Africa with the South African apartheid army, right? And he had fought with that army against the Southwest African People's Movement, with SWAPO, in Namibia. So, I mean, these institutional connections aren't crazy conspiracy theories. They're not like weird leftist fantasies. They're actual institutional linkages that exist between the dark forces of intelligence in the United States, in Israel, in what was apartheid South Africa, Argentina, Chile, the Condor Project that connected Argentina and Chile and Uruguay. I mean, all of these military structures are connected back to US intelligence, US military training, and the CIA. So I mean, it's deeply disturbing when we want to think about state violence. There it is. And then you also have, the immigration policies. I mean, that's our domestic expression of our foreign policy. So what is our immigration policy? Our immigration policy has been set up to force people who are desperate to survive to die in the desert, right? We force people to move through the most difficult terrain where a high possibility of dying of thirst and renal failure exists, because there are no resources, and it's illegal to give them water, right? People get arrested for giving water in the desert. That's violence. That's state violence, right? It comes in all forms. It doesn't have to be a bullet.
I don't know that there is much to say after that. I don't know, Claire. To me, that feels like that we would want to open this conversation to all of Victoria's interlocutors. I have many more questions, but we're there with you, Victoria. So let me turn it over to you, Claire.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brigittine.
Thank you so much, Brigittine and Victoria. And I just want to remind people, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I guess I'm just going to selfishly start with a question. Victoria, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, the book, like hearing you talk about the experience of becoming a mother and making the way that your body changed, the way your emotions changed, everything transforms, right? And it's a whole different orientation to your research, especially when you're doing research on the murder of somebody's child. It becomes so personal, and it completely changes your orientation to what you're doing. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you have taken care of yourself and self-preservation, how have you been able to do this work? Because, even reading your testimony about doing it and the moments of terror that you're describing yourself, if you can just talk a little bit about what kind of is life-giving to you and what makes it possible for you to keep going despite the trauma that you've survived, really, doing this work.
Thank you for that question, Claire. I think it's a really good question, and it's also something that I always talk about when I meet with young scholars who want to do this kind of work, because we really have to take care of ourselves if we want to do this over the long haul. I have a colleague who was a war correspondent, and he switched from being a war correspondent to being a city reporter, and he had a family, and I said, "Are you doing that, so you can be closer to your family?" And he said, "Partly, but mostly it's because all the war correspondents I know, by the time they hit 50, they're alcoholics or they're dead. And I don't want to be either of those things. And I haven't been able to figure out how to do my job and stay sane." And so I think that we have to figure out how to do our jobs and stay sane. And I want to go tell a little story and then come back to this again, because it's kind of part of it. I met Jorge because of Amilcar Mendez. I've known Amilcar Mendez since the early 1990s. And Amilcar Mendez was a teacher in rural Quiché. Amilcar Mendez collected 13,000 thumbprint signatures from Quiché Mayan men who did not want to participate in the army-controlled civil patrols during the genocide and the military regimes there. Amilcar Mendez is an incredibly courageous human being, and he was recognized for that work by the Robert F. Kennedy Foundation for Human Rights, and the Meteoron, and also the Jimmy Carter's Human Rights Center, as a courageous human rights leader. And that was how I met Jorge, because his daughter, Amilcar's daughter, Ana Maria Mendez, was a law student, and Claudina Isabel was her friend. And I've known Ana Maria since she was 3 years old. And so she was also 19 years old and a law student, and her friend was murdered. And so that was how Jorge was introduced to Amilcar, was by Ana Maria. And Ana Maria was working on this case as well. She's also in the book, because she was working on the case, and she talks about how what happened there affected her. And I'm reverting back to her, and I will come back to myself, but also because Ana Maria now is the Central America director for the Washington Office on Latin America. She's a human rights lawyer. She does amazing work. And one of the things that we talk about, that I speak with her about as well, is taking care of yourself, right? We all have to take care of ourselves, and we take care of each other. And for self-preservation, I think part of it is knowing, when you need a break, when you need a break. And if you're out in the field doing research, it might mean, for me, it would generally mean going back to the city when I was doing the work in the rural villages. And mostly it would just be because I would feel maxed out on listening to stories that I'd heard too many. I needed to just kind of decompress. But then people would want to go back to Guatemala City with me, and I'd be like, "Oh, well, that's great." And we get back to Guatemala City, it was because they wanted to tell me more stuff. And so I'd be like, "Okay." And so you can't always get away. But I think you have to know when to take a break. I also think that you have to do something to take care of yourself physically. You can, I swim. That's my own salvation, is swimming, is taking a breath and swimming. But I also think you really have to talk to people, and if you have to have close friends who you can speak with about these kinds of things. Reach out to me, reach out to Brigittine, and people who are listening, reach out to people who and when people offer, one of my friends sent me the nicest email. He's from Guatemala, lives in the United States, and he just said, if you ever need anyone to talk to, I know your work is hard, I can listen. And sometimes you don't even need to talk to that person, but just knowing that that person's there, just knowing that there's someone who can listen. But I think definitely you have to take breaks, and because you can't work in the long haul at warp speed, because I think it's really hard when you take on these kinds of cases and this kind of work, and you feel like I've got to work 24/7. And when in Oakdale, Louisiana, we often didn't have lawyers. We were signing documents waiting for a lawyer to claim a signature, because it was all running all volunteer initially before we had funds to hire people. And we would literally apologize to each other when we went home to go to sleep. And if we slept 5 hours, it was a lot, because we felt like if we didn't get these papers done, then people would get deported to their deaths. Right. And so you get in that. You can do that for a short period of time, but you can't do that over the long term, because it makes you physically sick. It can make you depressed. It can give you anxiety. It also makes you vulnerable. And this is one of the things that I always tell people who are doing this work is, every bad story I've ever heard from a political activist who had something bad happen to them, it begins with, if I hadn't been so tired, I would have noticed, right? If I hadn't been so tired, I would have noticed him on that corner. If I hadn't been so tired, I wouldn't have forgotten to lock that door, right? It's like it always starts with that. So, you have to get sleep. You have to take care of yourself. I think it's really important.
Thank you so much. I feel like that's another book that would be incredible, a whole nother conversation about just taking care of yourself and the real issue of burnout and forms of second degree trauma that researchers experience, especially, I mean, as women, researching femicide as mothers, it's a whole different. So thank you. There's two questions that I want to share that are both about writing. I'm going to just read these out loud, and they kind of build upon one another. So I'm just going to share. So when this question is, in many ways you write about terror, but mostly you write against terror. How do you approach this type of writing? What is the role of writing and telling stories of terror to ultimately defeat those who distribute terror? And that's one question about writing. Do you want to answer that? And then I can,
Yeah, I think if that's, that I won't, that has a lot of pieces to it. I think
that's from Joan Lopez.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's really important. It's a really important question. And in fact, we've had conversations about this. If you write, I think what you can't do, I think that's a better way to start. What you can't do is, it can't be an orgy of violence. It can't be these like graphic pornographic descriptions of violence, because you reify violence that way. You give it power. And I think if you want to write against terror, you have to take it apart. Part of writing against it is dismantling it. And the way that I think the way that you dismantle it is to show the bureaucracy of it, right? Because ultimately terror is bureaucratic. And it's supported by bureaucratic proceduralism, right? It's supported by people who will tick off boxes but do nothing. And that's Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, right? Is that it exists because we allow it to exist that way. And so I think if we want to write against terror, that we have to take it apart, and identify the different components of it, from the individual to the structure. Daniel Goldhagen has done really interesting work, I think. And one of the projects that he's written about is like, how does genocide happen? How can this kind of mass violence happen? And he says that in his research, and I tend to agree with this, that and this is why we have to prosecute genocidaires. The genocide happened under Rios Montt. That's when everything really ramped up. Like there was a lot of killing, there were military regimes, but just the flat out open genocide happened under Rios Montt. Because if you have that kind of leader with that kind of vertical control and command responsibility without any checks and balances, then you have this tremendous and immense terror that can exist. And so when we write against it, those are the things that we have to take apart.
Thank you so much for that. response, Victoria. This is a question that's also about writing. This question is from Martha Lincoln. It reads, "Hi, Victoria. Thank you so much for illuminating this book and discussion. Could you speak about your approach to writing this complex, multivocal, genre crossing text? How did this work get started, developed, and finished?" I think you do touch a little bit on that in the response that you just gave us, but I think the writing process would be really interesting to hear about.
Thank you, and thank you, Martha. I want to say many of the things that are beautiful in this book are because Martha is like such a tremendous friend and colleague, and like the most elegant editor friend I've ever had. I mean, if you want something to look beautiful, you send it to Martha and talk about it with her. I mean, Martha's amazing, and she's probably turning completely pink because she's completely humble. I'm sure I'm embarrassing her, but it's true. But I think that's a really good question. And so the way I wrote this book, and I would not necessarily recommend this. My writing process. Okay, I love the book The Orchid Thief. I don't know if folks have read The Orchid Thief. I think it's a beautiful book, and I made notes of all the things that I loved about that book. You know, find something that you love that's not related to what you do, right? The Orchid Thief is not about Guatemala. It's not, but it's this very interesting book. I wrote everything that I liked about it. I liked the way that history was woven into the present time. And I started thinking about how I would do that on a book about Guatemala. And I started writing on index cards, like absolutely every single thing I wanted to have in my book. I did. I had like giant stack of index cards, every single thing I wanted to have in my book. I didn't sit down and write an outline. I didn't say I want chapter 1 to be this, or chapter 2 to be this, or chapter 3 to be this. I just wrote all of these index cards, all the things that I wanted to have in my book. And then I would just like pick an index card that looked interesting to me that day and write about that topic. So in the end, I had all of these pieces of stories and vignettes, and the other thing in the writing process, my friend who's a poet, Amira Thorin, I feel like some of my best writing was when I sat in a room with her, because she's writing poetry. We literally had desks across from each other. We would say, okay, we're going to meet at the office. It's an office at the Graduate Center. We're going to meet at the office and we're going to write. So we would get into the office, we would have a cup of tea, we would talk about what we were going to write that day, and then we wouldn't talk at all. It would be like, okay, I'm going in. We both put on our little headphones and listen to some music or whatever, you know, some classical music, whatever we were going to do, jazz, whatever. And we would just write. And the rule was that you can't talk. And I remember the first person who I came up with a writing, like sort of a way to write, was with my friend and colleague Inigo Bryce Garcia, who's a historian. We shared an office when we were doctoral students at Latin American Studies at Stanford. And we also shared an office with another doctoral student whose side gig was managing a local band. And so he would come into the office that the three of us had, and he would get on that phone and he would spend most of the day calling every bar in the Bay Area, asking if they wanted to host his band. And so we were just like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Right? And so we decided that we were going to have writing time. And so we put up a sign on the door that said silence, only writing. And then we would mark down the hours. And then Inigo said to me one day, he said, you know, I think that we're making a mistake because we're just spending too much time writing notes. What we should do is just sit down and just write. We know what we want to say, and then we can put in the citations, or if we're missing a fact, we know what the fact will be more or less. We'll put that in afterwards. Let's just write. And so that kind of became like the writing process is, you can't email, you can't talk on the phone, you can't text, you can listen to music, but you write, and you can't read, you have to write. Like when you're writing, you have to write. And so then I had like this mass of vignettes and different stories and different pieces. And then I started thinking about how I wanted to put it together. And Textures of Terror was actually, I had a bigger book, but by the time it was done, it was too big of a book. It was like 450 pages. And you can't have 450 pages, and you can't teach a book that big. And we all know, students don't want books that are that long. It also makes them really expensive. People go into a bookstore and look at books, and if it's a really thick book, they're less likely to purchase it. And I struggled for a really long time, because the other part of the book is about the disappeared of Guatemala. It was kind of like my opus on Guatemala was what this book was. And so I decided to split it into two. And because Claudina Isabel her father's story is the arc of femicide, right? It's the arc of this violence in Guatemala. And the other book that is almost done is called Friends Who Disappear. And it's the story of Dr. Marvin Perez, who was 14 years old in 1982 and was disappeared along with 13 other children. And they were all tortured and beaten. They were first by the police, then they were passed to the military, and then they were taken out of the police station and taken to a clandestine jail. And 3 of the children didn't survive. And so the arc of that book about the disappeared is really Marvin's story, which is an incredible story of survival and hope and perseverance. And he's a doctor in Los Angeles now. So that was my writing process, was just trying to write everything, because I felt it felt flat to me. And I'm not recommending to other people that you make this your writing process, because it took me a really long time to finish this book. And part of it was because I hadn't given myself, maybe I should have given myself a little bit more structure, but in the end, I really like the way this book is, and I like the way the other book is shaping up as I'm finishing it. So I don't know. I mean, everyone has their own writing process, and Brigittine's right. I mean, I do have lots of stacks of paper, and they're like discrete stacks of different projects that I have. So yeah, that's my writing process, I guess. It's kind of, the anthropology and physical anthropology, the history of like kind of human evolution, that there are like 2 kinds of people. There are the pilers and the sorters, right? And so the sorters are the people who have really organized files on their desktop and have really organized files at home. And the pilers are the ones who like always have to look on different memory sticks. That's me. Always have to look through lots of folders. That's me. Like no consistent filing system. And I guess that's my writing process as well. I'm a piler.
Thank you, Victoria. I do want to just make one quick comment about, you said this book took a really long time to write, and I think that's part of the beauty of the book, because that's a richness, is the time, right? Like that is, everything today is like so instantaneous and immediate responses, and part of the beauty of anthropology and the work that you have done is the long-term, relationship and commitment, and that really shines through. And I think that's yeah, really a testament to your commitment and to the entire project of accompaniment. I think we have time for one more question, or maybe 2, but this is a question from Tatiana, who asks, this is such a wonderful event. Looking forward to reading your book. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. Femicide laws in Guatemala have been used against women in the system. Can you elaborate on this? Is femicide legislation in Latin America working? For a while, there was hope that the dissemination of these laws in the region would improve the way femicide cases are investigated and penalized and deter criminal conduct, but I fear that this is not the case. Any thoughts?
That's a great question. And I think it's Tatiana Devia, who is another great human rights lawyer. So thank you, Tatiana, for that question. So in Guatemala, I mean, the part of the issue is that really the law doesn't kick in until after women are dead. And then when it does kick in, 98% of the cases are left in impunity. Only 2% end up being processed. And this is one of the questions. It's a really good question, Febby, because this is the question that the government lawyers always ask on an asylum claim. Isn't it true that in Guatemala they have centers to assist women? And isn't it true that there's this femicide law? It's like, yeah, and in the Constitution of Guatemala, everyone has equality too, but that's not true. Like, the problem isn't what's written on paper, it's what happens in practice and application. And so I don't think the ley de femicidio, the femicide law, in and of itself in Guatemala is bad. Absolutely not. The problem is that the people who want to use the laws and make it happen are being forced to flee, right? We have like 30 justice operators who've been forced out of Guatemala. 2 attorneys general have been forced out of Guatemala. Judges forced out of Guatemala. And these are women also. I was speaking with a human rights lawyer in Guatemala a week and a half ago, and he was saying, he said, Victoria, like the next nodal point of these of the oligarchy and organized crime is criminalizing women lawyers, right? Because there are all of these incredible women doing this work, and it's literally criminalizing their labor as they try to make the law, try to fairly apply the law and make the system respond, not do bureaucratic proceduralism where you just tick off a box.
Yeah, that is a fascinating reminder too of the ways in which femicide looks very similar and also is very different throughout the region. There's a question about Ciudad Juarez and thinking about the comparison. Ciudad Juarez was kind of the emblematic case that put the horrors of femicide on the map in Latin America and at the border. I don't know if you want to touch on that. The question is about how important it is to remind public opinion to the dimension of femicides in Guatemala in comparison with the killings of women in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, that had an international reputation. Is there a silence that Victoria's book is breaking? Could Victoria talk a little bit about that comparison?
Sure. And thank you so much. I hope that that would be my hope, that this book contributes to breaking this silence and showing the different levels of terror and violence to which women are subjected. And certainly, this is international. It's not just an issue in Guatemala. And the numbers in Guatemala are horrific and extraordinarily high, but women are subjected to violence all over the world. And Kerry Kennedy was co-counsel in the Inter-American Court and spoke so eloquently about the kind of violence that women are subjected to all over the world, but that these cases matter. And it's important to remember the women of Chihuahua and Ciudad Juarez who were killed, and the killings that continue in Mexico as well. But I want to remember Clyde Snow, Dr. Clyde Snow, the grandfather of forensic exhumations, pretty much. And he's the reason the Argentine forensic anthropology team exists. He's the reason the Guatemalan team exists. And he started this work. And Clyde was asked to go to Mexico by the American Association for the Advancement of Science to investigate those killings in Juarez. And he, Clyde was he would call himself a good old boy from Oklahoma. And he wore a hat and he had a cigar, and he said, I said, well, what do you think? What's your conclusion about Juarez? And he said, it's like everywhere I go, they all hate me now. And I said, why? And he said, because they want one answer, and there isn't just one answer here. It's not, they want me to say it's a serial killer. No, it's not a serial killer. There may be serial killers, but we can't tell. And this is the same thing in Guatemala. There may be serial killers of women killing women in Guatemala, but we can't tell because the police don't do their job. They don't do proper investigation. They don't do proper forensic work. They don't do proper prosecutions. And so if you don't do your job, you can't unpack, identify, and see what happened. But Clyde's conclusion about Juarez was the same. It's the same kinds of structures of drug trafficking, corrupt government, impunity, police who don't do their job, and in fact, impunity where the very institutions that are supposed to be protecting your rights are actually the ones who are violating your rights, both systematically as an institution as well as on the individual level, the people who represent those institutions. And so when you have good lawyers, good prosecutors, good police, good judges, they get booted out of that system.
Do we have time just for one more question? And then I think we'll wrap up. This question is from Jennifer, and she asks, I'm so happy to be here and learn so much. I'm a high school teacher, and I'm wondering if there's a way to empower younger people, high school age students, to get involved. I just think that's a nice way to kind of think about hope and a younger generation thinking about these questions. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer. That's a great question. I think, and first of all, I think high school students are really interested because I often get emails from high school students who are writing papers on something in Guatemala, and I always try to respond. I can't always, but I really do try to respond to individual student questions, because there are people. When I was 18 years old at Sacramento State and doing a research paper, my professor gave me Edward Said's phone number. Edward Said was his friend, and I had no idea who Edward Said was. And I called him to interview him for my paper. And then I found out years later who I had been interviewing, right? Because I still was completely clueless. I didn't know. He was amazing, but he spent an hour on the phone talking to me, which I thought was incredibly generous. But in any case, I think for inspiring high school students, I think they're really interested in these stories. I think they want to know stories of other young people they want to know stories of other young people from other countries, whether it's Guatemala or Mexico, or there's a really nice book actually Michelle Baino wrote that's called Youth in Post-War Guatemala. And it's really interesting because you hear stories from youth about how they understand what happened and what they think. Susanna Kaiser also did a really nice book about Argentina, where they're like interviews and conversations with young people. I think that young people, to inspire them on these issues, they need to hear stories. I don't think that they want to read the kind of dry history books that I was subjected to in high school. I think they're much more inspired if they can hear stories or see testimonies. You can go to the website of the Center for Advanced Study on Genocide, on the Holocaust and Genocide at the University of Southern California. There's a whole archive of films that you can access. Brigittine knows a lot more about how to use that than I do, but I think there are lots of different ways to inspire people, but I think it's the one-on-one communication that they feel when they read a story that's different than if they read a book that's about the history of militarism or something. And I think those books are really important, right? I mean, I think all of the books that talk about these important issues matter, but for motivating young people, I think that they're most motivated when they can read individual stories. But I bet Jennifer already knows that because she's a teacher. Thank you.
So I think that's an amazing place to wrap up today's conversation. I also have some ideas about the question about getting younger students involved. I think it's such an important question. I just want to thank everybody for being here today. And Victoria, I really want to thank you for not only being here, but taking the time to write this book and to elevate Jorge's story is like, it's just so needed right now. And thank you. Thank you for your accompaniment. Thank you for being just a role model to so many women specifically who this means so much to. So I'm getting emotional again. So I'm gonna wrap this up. And Brigittine, thank you for setting this up, and thank you for assigning Victoria's book in your class.
Oh, Thank you so much. Thank you all. This was just such a beautiful, beautiful way to initiate my book out, launch it out into the world. And I'm so honored, Claire. Thank you so much. Thank you, truly.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I am just going to put the network, our webpage, into the chat, and would love to add folks to. We do have like a mailing list, and we have all of our past conversations online, and we'll also have this one.
Can I say one thing? Sorry. Just because I forgot, you know, I on our announcement for the event, it said you can do save 30 to save 30%
Yes.
from UC Berkeley, but the month of May is actually 40% for the whole month of May on all UC Press books. So you can do save 40 and save 40 instead of 30 if you still haven't bought the book and want to get it. So I just wanted to share that additional
Mother's
saving.
Day, you know, get all of your academic texts for Mother's Day, 40% off. Okay, thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you, Brigittine. Thank you to our interpreters.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. And yes, thank you.